This is a brief introduction to creating a simple interactive graphical user interface. And it starts with the code that we have on our schedule. And we will be developing together this interface right here. And to begin coding this interface, you have a couple steps that you've got to consider, and we're going to talk about those in a general sense. The first thing you have to do is that each one of these, and I'll point them out, each one of these different components is an interface or graphical object. And so just like you do with any other variable that you or object that you want to use, you have to create those objects by declaring variables and then creating the objects. So in our program here to create this interface, we'll have objects from the following classes here: JFrame, JPanel, JTextField, JLabel, and JButton. And each one of these items in this interface is one of those, an object of one of these classes. So if I'm going to identify that in this example here, this blue window is what we call a JFrame. This yellow box here is a JPanel object. This here where it says number of cars is a JLabel object. This is what we call a JTextField object, and I bet you can guess what this is. This is a JButton object. So all of these objects have names and have been created with the new statement. So once you have those objects created, you can place them, organize them on your in your container. This is called, your JFrame is called a container, and then start working on setting up a relationship between when the button is clicked and what you want to have happen in your interface. And in this simple program, we're clicking on the button and incrementing this number here. That's all we're doing. We're starting with 1, and every time we click, it increments. So to have this text field recognize that it's supposed to change when the button is clicked, we're going to have to do a little extra work here. And one of these is to implement a listener. And a listener is just a piece of code that is automatically listening for events. Clicking a button would be an event. So we have to set up a relationship, and we will be doing that in our code so that it recognizes that when the button is pressed, it needs to do something. What work needs to be done is up to you, but that work that is going to be done when the button is clicked will be done inside a method called actionPerformed. And all we really want to do is just increment a counter. So that's a general sense of what we're going to be doing with this code. So let's go and take a look at the code and work it up together.
So here's our activity to create that interface, and I've changed the color a little bit, but it's essentially the same. So we're going to go ahead and let's download the CarCounter Java and the CarCounter panel. We'll take a look at that code. And just to remember, just as a reminder, the back of this activity has some helpful notes for you to go back and review. Those are there because those are what I consider some key steps in working up the GUI. But I'll let you take a look at those on your own. All right, I've opened up Eclipse and I have the two files downloaded. The CarCounter panel will have an error in it. We're going to go ahead and complete that. That's why it still has an error. But let's look at how we've got this set up. The CarCounter, when you look at this, it's your main, it's your entry point. And inside here, this is just like a tester that we've done with our other assignments. And when you look at this, we've created one object, or actually two objects, a frame, JFrame, and a panel. And we're calling the JFrame constructor here. And then we are going to go ahead and create an object of CarCounter panel. That's this other class that we're going to finish implementing. And we've created an object of that type called panel. And then we have a couple other things that we're doing in here that are kind of boilerplate when you're working with frames. We want to set the default close so that when you click the button in the corner, this button right here, you want the window to close and the application to close. So that's what that does. We're going to go ahead and add the panel to our frame, and then we want to pack it and make it visible. So those are all the things that you need so that your GUI displays properly. So let's look at the class that you're going to be completing. Kind of is going to look just like your other classes that you've created, in that it has instance variables, it has a constructor, has some imports. So we've imported our AWT and our swing. We know in our GUI that we want to have a label, a text field, and a button. So we've created those instance variables, and the integer instance variable car count is what we're going to use to increment how each time a car enters, let's say, our parking garage, etc. So the first thing, just like you did with your other homework assignments, is that you create a constructor, and the constructor's task is to give initial values or to set up the object of this type. So we've gone ahead and we've got our car count set to 0. We've got to take care of car label, which we have. We've created the object and called its constructor. And now, let's go ahead and create these other two objects. So car field is a J text field, and we're going to go ahead and set its width, because that's what the constructor is requesting, to 10, a width of 10, which is width 10 columns. And we'll go ahead and create the button. So we're calling its constructor, and inside the button, we wanted the button to say press here. Whoops. And that will go ahead and set up those buttons. So at this point, we probably don't have any errors. And let's run our tester and see if we get a starting GUI that we kind of like. Okay, so we don't have anything in here except for the frame, and the frame's title is CarCounter. And we're going to go ahead and create the other objects, but now we've got something that's running. So let's go back to CarCounter panel and complete it. So nothing was being displayed at this point. So let's go ahead and add those components to our panel. So I'm going to add each of these, the car label, and I'll add the other components also. All right, so I've added the other two components, and now let's go ahead and save that and run our tester again and see what our panel is starting to look like. Okay, we're starting to get there. Again, our frame, but the first thing the frame does inside your tester is create a car counter panel and then add that panel to its frame. So we want this to go ahead, and when we click it, it should increment by 1, but it's not doing anything. So we've got a couple other tasks to complete. All right, so our next task is to work on this listener, and we're going to call it a button listener. It implements action listener, which means that we have to include this method called action performed. And inside action performed, we want to do two things. We want to update the counter, and then we want to put that value of the counter back into our text field, and we want all this to happen when the button is pushed. So the first task is to update our counter, which we called car count. So I'll just update it by 1. And then we wanted to go ahead and put that value that's been updated into our text field. So the name of our object is car text field, and since it's an object of type J text field, all of these methods have already been implemented for us, and we want to set the text. So there's the method to set the text, and it's expecting a string. That's important. So let's go ahead and click set text, And we think we want to put car counter in there, or car count, but we got an issue. So the issue is that this is an integer, but set text says I want a string. So we've got to convert this integer into a string, and we're going to use our wrapper classes. And what this does is it takes the integer car count. Okay, it takes the integer car count and converts it to a string for this. And now let's see what happens when we run our code. So we're running our main. We click it. Nothing's happening yet because we've got step number 3 to complete, and that is to tell our GUI that we want to be listening for the button pressed. And so we have to go ahead and connect the event handler with the event source. So this is the event handler, and we're going to connect it with the source. And our event source is the button, and our object is called car button. And to go ahead and connect that, there it is. It knows about add action listener. We're going to do that, and we're going to connect it to our button listener. So let's do that. New button listener. Whoop. So let's kind of dissect this a little bit. So add action listener is a piece of code that's already written for you that is going to take this component and the events that it creates. It will go ahead and connect that to an object of this type down here. And that's all this is doing. It's just creating an on-the-fly object because that's calling its constructor. And what really happens is when that button gets pressed, it's going to automatically look for action performed and complete whatever task that you have outlined inside action performed. So let's go ahead and see if this is closer to what we want. All right, every time we're pressing it. So every time this gets pressed, it goes to that method called action performed and updates the counter. Let's go back and look at that code. It automatically goes here, updates this, and then it displays that value in this text field by setting its text. Let's go back and take a look. And there we go. So as cars are coming into our parking lot, we're going ahead and keeping track of those. All right. So that essentially is the first part of the activity. That's activity 1.